William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. Welcome to the College of Complexes, being held at Barbeck's Restaurant at 8949 Garland Road, Dallas, Texas. Gently embracing the east side of White Rock Lake. When I entered, I was greeted like coming home to Grandma's house, warm and friendly. When visiting the Barbeck's Restaurant, tell them you want your reservations for the next College of Complex class.
This is our 220th meeting. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require our speakers take a position on an issue and express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. After that, we have questions and answers. Before we put our speaker on, are there any announcements? Now's the time for announcements. Anyone have any announcements they want to make?
Monday, St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. Have you heard that? Yes. Any other announcements? Anybody have any announcements they want to make? Susan wants to make an announcement. Susie, make your announcement.
Hey guys, how are you doing tonight? Can you hear me? You didn't listen to Tom, so I'm going to start over with the announcements. Next Saturday from 10 to 12 in the morning is your senatorial district convention. If you are a Democrat or a Republican, go look it up. Seriously, get involved in your democratic process. Senatorial district convention is the next step to going to the state convention. Now, the Democrats in the House, the state convention is going to be here in Dallas in June, the end of June. So go to your senatorial district convention next Saturday morning, sign up as a delegate there so that you can also be a delegate at state, okay? Also, I have a second announcement. Wow, Tom, the sound is really bad here tonight. Is it this one? Okay, a second announcement. And I don't want to take away from Tom's great big deal next weekend, but I will say that there's a fundraiser for Milton Whitley, who's running for House District 113. He is the Democratic nominee. That'll be in Garland at 6 o'clock next Saturday night. So if you're interested in supporting his candidacy, see me after the meeting. Thank you.
What? That's for that sound thing. Anyway, any other announcements? You have an announcement, all right. This thing is not working too well.
Excuse my mouth full of food. I just want to tell you, it's not on tonight's meeting announcement, but 2 weeks from tonight.
Separate the mics. Separate the mics. Further apart. Thank you.
Ray will be speaking to us, and his presentation that evening is going to be sort of a collage of subjects. You'll see the format it's put in when the notice comes out this next week. But Jim Davis is on next Saturday night. I'm not sure I understood exactly what he's going to talk about, but we'll find out when he opens the book and starts. And then Ray will be the next week, and if anybody has something to talk about, we'll see Tom or call me and we'll get you on the calendar. Everybody's familiar with being here. I haven't done it for the last couple of sessions, but the folks here at Barbeck's are kind to us. They give us the meeting room without a meeting room fee, which lets us keep our little $3 fee down. That just covers our printing and paying for the speakers' meals and miscellaneous stuff that needs to be done. But be sure you order some food and you're generous with the server who comes in here and takes care of all of us at once. We appreciate that, don't we? Thanks. Carry on, Tom.
Jim already announced our speaker for next week, so Our speaker tonight is Carol Donovan. She's sitting right there. She's an attorney for 30 years. She's going to talk about restoring civility to our communities. She has a background in probate law and is a Democratic candidate for Texas House District 107. She also has a background in resolving disputes and facilitating communication. She's going to discuss the problems and ramifications of restoring civility to our communities, including ways we as individuals can help. She will also discuss methods used by various groups in the U.S. to restore civility in their local communities, and will conclude on what we need to do to ensure civility and is practiced in maintaining our dealing with each other and with our communities at large. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Carol Donovan. You have the floor.
All right.
Down, Tom.
Huh?
Down.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Yes, I'm a little height challenged here, so. Well, this is good. Can everybody see and hear from where they are right now? Okay. I know that civility on its face doesn't sound like a real controversial topic, but obviously incivility generally comes around at a time when there is a controversial topic. And of course there are differences of opinion about how do we go about restoring civility in our community. And so you can be thinking about ideas as we go through the speech and talk about that. It's actually very timely. I don't know if y'all been keeping up with this issue about home rule. That's an idea that came in about how we might our city might replace DISD with a home rule charter school program. There's pros, there's cons about that. But this week there had been so many questions and a lot of people concerned that there was a gathering down there in the city hall for this meeting where people were going to discuss this. It became so rowdy and people started yelling and screaming that our mayor just walked out of the meeting. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that walking out of a meeting is always the best way to handle things, but I'm just pointing out that this is something that we really have to deal with on a day-to-day basis and in current times. 2 out of every 3 Americans polled believe that civility is a major problem. And most Americans believe that the most uncivil place in our country is on the road as we're driving. That and government. In the entire area of government. In fact, government actually is the first place voted as the most uncivil place, and the traffic is the second. But these are not the only places that are uncivil. There was a recent poll that was taken by a magazine, a women's magazine online actually, called iVillage. And they get 30 million hits a month, and so they decided to take a little poll about the relationships that people have, that women have with their mother-in-laws. And they found out that 51%, now for all of you who are keeping up with elections, that's the majority, 51% of the women said they would rather clean house than listen to their mother-in-law talk. And 28% said, heck, I'd rather have a root canal. So this morning I am speaking to you, or this evening I am speaking to you about civility. And I'm going to cover 3 general topics. But one of them is the need for civility, and the second is the method where we might be able to restore civility. And third is just general ideas about what different groups in different places in the United States have done in order to attempt to restore civility. Now, most people think of civility being prevalent in the good old days. But I am here to tell you, and with evidence, that the good old days were not always civil. I know in Congress, you always think about, at least in the past, you think about everyone getting along so civilly. I remember growing up, and when the C-SPAN came around and you'd hear the senators talking to each other, they would say, "Would the gentleman from Maine yield the floor," etc., etc., and they just sounded so polite to each other. Now, they don't seem to sound that polite to each other anymore when we listen to them on TV, but is that because they're less polite, or is it because we now have more access to hearing what they say to each other? So we can compare those pleasantries to political ads that we see, and of course many of those are very disturbing, the way they attack each other. And of course, some of us may remember a time when television wasn't in existence, or if it was in existence, it was primarily there for wrestling and the Milton Berle show. So is it that we've worsened, or is it because we just didn't have as much access to the conversations that were taking place? In any event, we can get very shocked about the lack of civility, and sometimes I think that we become immune to it. We almost get so used to it that it just becomes just part of our life, and we kind of tune it out. But I really enjoy sharing with people an example of incivility, even back in the, quote, good old days, when we think of the senators and congressmen being so polite to each other. I'd like to take you back to May of 1856, when a congressman beat a U.S. senator unconscious with his cane on the Senate floor, and in his defense, one of his colleagues explained that if the congressman believed the senator had been a gentleman, then he might have challenged the senator to a duel instead. But the term civility means different things to different people. We could take time out if we wanted to even ask each other what is the definition of civility, but I propose to you that some of that might come out in some of the opinions that are expressed later after my presentation. And also, I would argue to you that the term civility is like the term peace. I mean, different people think different things about what the definition. But when I ask around to people and say, okay, what is civility to you? I get answers like courtesy, politeness, respect, tolerance, good listening, ethical behavior, self-control, high standards of conduct. Now that last answer always surprises me, because I always considered civility to be a minimum standard, not a high standard. I mean, seriously, would we consider it a compliment if someone walked up to us and said, "Oh, how very civil of you"? You know, it just doesn't sound like you've crossed a high threshold. Civility is difficult to define because it is influenced by so many factors. It could be influenced by the way we were raised. It could be influenced by the parents that we had, the teachers we had, different experiences that we had, our expectations. Now, some Southerners contend that the civility standards are so much higher in the South. And in the North, they may regard us as ruffians. Now, and I'm not going to ask our gentleman from London what he thinks about Texas politics. But nevertheless, in most of the public settings and in many private forums, civility is what I call the elephant in the room, because there's always somebody that is not being civil, is not expressing themselves civilly, and a lot of times they're shooting themselves in their own foot, because they might have a great argument, a great proposal, but because of the way they're presenting it, it makes all of us want to just turn off and go the other way. The lack of civility is especially noticeable in elections, and we happen to be in an election season this year. and as concerned citizens, we study the issues, we examine the character of the candidates. In these days of worldwide electronic communication, we're not just trying to determine who we want to represent us. Frankly, we're also looking at who do we want representing us in the world. So if we have a governor, for example, the state of Texas, then what he or she does is picked up on the media, and it reflects across the nation, and that reflects the way the nation thinks about Texas. And likewise, when we elect an American president, that person's face and their speeches and quotes are reflected through electronic media and a lot of other kind of media all across the world. And so that person is not just our representative, but it is a person that is representing us to the rest of the world. So I would say that civility is in fact extremely important. It has a lot of ramifications. Now you would think, since all of us in the room remember 9/11, you would have thought that after 9/11 that it would have caused people in the United States to be even more aware of their social responsibility to help heal our nation. But in the congressional race that followed very soon after that, there was a Dallas congressional candidate who stated publicly in a television interview that he would not rule out the option of a violent overthrow of the government if the elections did not produce a change in leadership. So what kind of message are we sending to our kids here in the world if someone is going on television and asserting some kind of violent overthrow? And this is not just somebody who's just off the street, this is somebody running for Congress. Now, believe it or not, civility has been a subject of interest for a long, long time. When George Washington was only 14 years of age, he made a list of 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. That was the title. Now, personally, I have a hard time believing that a 14-year-old would just sit down and write 110 rules like that. I suspect he must have been really bad and the teacher made him do that, you know. But I won't burden you with all 110 rules. But I do want to share with you number 80. Since it could be relevant to my remarks. And that is, be not tedious in discourse or in reading unless you find the company pleased therewith. And in plain English, I think that means don't talk too long. So I will try to abide by that. Numerous groups have studied the subject of civility, usually determining that it is in fact a minimum standard, that civility sets minimum standards. One of these groups is a non-profit organization called the Institute for Civility in Government. Now, has anybody heard of this organization? Well, interestingly enough, it's based in Houston, Texas. It believes that a key threat to an effective government is the growing polarization in society among race, socioeconomic groups, religion, age, politics, and special interests. Now that's their mission statement, but simply put, they're concerned about the growing intolerance in our society. And in myself, in my own campaign, knocking on doors, the word polarization comes up a lot, which is really strange. I'd never heard that word growing up, and all of a sudden, I'm having a lot of the residents in my district are saying, I'm so sick of the polarization. So it's good that I know what that is. You know, I think they were talking about the North Pole or something. But I think it's fascinating that because of their reaction to the incivility, they're getting more and more upset about the fact that our Congress seems to be stymied, not able to get along, not able to reach across the aisle. And they're not faulting one party or another. I mean, they seem to be equally disgusted with both parties when they discuss that with me. But they want, and this is their own definition of civility at the Institute, claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading someone else's in the process. Now, this particular definition reminds me of something my father used to always say to me when he and I disagreed about something, and that was his statement that your freedom to fight for your rights ends at the tip of my nose. Now, I realize he didn't make that up. You know, I've heard that before. But it's basically sort of a layman's version of what the Institute for Civility had defined civility to be. So how do we reclaim civility? I would assert to you that civility is a learned behavior. It's obviously not something that comes naturally to people, because as Tom Hanks told Gina Davis in the movie A League of Their Own, if it were easy, everyone would be doing it. Of course, he was talking about baseball. But it is a learned behavior, and so therefore we must teach civility in the home, the schools, the church, and the communities. Now, there's differences of opinion about how one goes about teaching civility. I know there's a program that was very popular in the DISD at one point called Character Counts. It was a program that was taught in some of the curriculum in DISD. There have been other programs, some fall under the term of peace skills or tolerance. But that has been a way that some communities have gone about trying to teach civility. Now, parents are generally considered to be the most influential person and role models in their children's life. Therefore, parenting is a huge responsibility, as my own mother can attest. But we all try to be good parents, and those of us who are not parents, you surely have nieces and nephews, and you try to be a good role model. Perhaps you speak a little differently when you're around children. Hopefully you do. But, or maybe you are somebody who speaks so well without any cursing whatsoever that you don't have to change your behavior in any way when you're around persons of a different generation or people who might be influenced by your behavior. I can give you one example of where it was really driven into me, in particular, of how a parent's behavior is in fact noticed by a child. My son was in high school at the time, which is just teenagehood. It's just such a lovely age. But I was chairing the International Women's Peace Conference. It was being held here in Dallas, and I was under a little stress because there were like 1,400 delegates, 3 of whom were Nobel Peace Laureates, and it was just a wonderful experience overall, but it was a lot of work. And I came home one day to a message from the teacher that Patrick had failed to turn in a paper that he had told me he had finished and turned in, and I was more than slightly irritated. And as I began to speak to him, you could say that my voice level and volume was raising considerably, and I was highly irritated as I got into a full scream. And at that point, he looked at me and said, "Excuse me, am I speaking to the chairwoman of the International Women's Peace Conference?" Well, of course he had a point, but I still grounded him. Now, some schools and community centers offer counseling and parenting classes. When asked why he attended such classes, one father explained, "Well, I figure I can take the time now to raise my son right, or I can visit him in jail later." So in the community, there are a few organizations as helpful in teaching civility as Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. Just think, if everyone was trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, then we would all be getting along. Now in church, children attend Sunday school in some cases, or religious classes or prayer meetings, depending on their respective faith. And the guidelines of civility in one form or another are generally taught. if nothing else, through the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Now that golden rule is sometimes referred to by scholars as ethic of reciprocity. And it's generally known through the Christian faith, at least we identify that in the golden rule. However, there are versions of the golden rule in virtually every religion in the world. So that thrust, that religion, that doctrine is certainly prevalent in all religion. The Dalai Lama explained that every religion emphasizes human improvement, love, respect for others, sharing other people's suffering. On the lines, every religion has more or less the same viewpoint and the same goal, he explained. So we got civility established as a minimum standard. So how do we raise the bar? It's not enough to reclaim civility. An amazing number of communities have in fact consciously raised the bar, expecting a higher standard of civility in their community. And considerable research has been done by a group known as the National Association of Counties. That group was founded in 1935. It is the only national organization that represents all 3,068 county governments in the United States. And in its report, which was entitled The Search of Civility, this association explored different ways that civility could be improved in county government, because that's what they were concentrating on. It represents examples of some counties developing a pledge of civility for all that were participating in the government. Some would create policies, saying that that was their policy to be civil to each other. Some had actually enacted codes, statutes, guidelines, and rules of decorum were adopted in the actual format where people were going to be speaking. That would sometimes authorize local law enforcement officials to remove persons whose behavior was not in compliance with the civility standards that they had created. Then some communities instituted an all-right civility initiative. And my favorite example is one that took place in Howard County, Maryland. The county government there actually put together a civility initiative. They adopted a code of 15 principles of civility. They adopted a slogan: civility is a journey, not a destination. The county government treated this initiative like it was a full-blown campaign. They appointed a board of advisors, and then in January 2000, the board adopted a civility strategic plan. And they appointed a local and popular congressman, Elijah Cummings, there in Maryland, to be the honorary chair of this particular advisors group. And he was asked to help market the initiative. And as one county executive explained about the Choose Civility campaign, which is why they called it, he said, in some ways, the campaign has come to define us. And they believed that, if nothing else, the campaign put the subject of civility it spotlighted it in the community. It gave it importance. It served as a role model. It reminded people to be civil, to be on their best behavior, to at the very least be respectful to each other. And he believed that the campaign was successful. In 2010, there was actually a civility conference that was held at the Allegheny College in Pennsylvania. They called it Pathways to Civility. And this was more on the student level. They invited students from all different campuses. And that was one way that they took care of it. They found that in their own poll, actually, there was a separate poll called the Center for Political Participation, took a poll on the issue of civility at around that same time, and found that 95% of Americans believed that it was important for a healthy democracy for people to be able to disagree respectfully with each other. And more than 75% in that poll agreed with the statement, right now, Washington is broken. The founders of the Institute for Civility, the one I talked about that's down in Houston, have published a book entitled Reclaiming Civility in the Public Square, 10 Rules That Work. They encourage citizens to seek common ground at the beginning point of the dialogue. In other words, you don't just start in with your fussing about the differences that you have. You start out and basically lay the groundwork and say, okay, what do we agree on? And frankly, I can tell you that having been trained as a professional mediator that works with the Dallas County courts, that is a very successful technique in mediation, is to get the parties to first concentrate on what they agree on and then distinguish the few things that they disagree on. The news is rampant right now with stories about, teen bullying and teen suicide, and the aggressive behavior of bullies is anything but civil. The majority of articles that we read talk about how the victims that were chosen by the bullies are chosen because they're different. They're different in some way. It varies how they are different, but it's always they're picking on somebody different than them. And for this reason, I think it enforces that civility training, including tolerance, is essential in our community. Some communities work with, there's not a lot, but there's some communities that adopt a program of what some people call peace education, some people call it tolerance training, some people call it anti-bullying training, but the factors are similar, in fact almost exactly alike in civility training. You're talking about tolerance, peer mediation, negotiation, listening skills, nonviolent communication, conflict resolution, anti-bullying techniques. In the North Texas area alone, there are, I've counted at least 8 established peace education programs. And again, they don't always call themselves a peace education program because some people feel like that sounds a little touchy-feely, but basically it's tolerance training. In preparing the next generation, we must prepare the leaders of the next generation. And role modeling is adopted by most every leadership training study as being the best kind of preparation. But there's some untapped resources that can help us succeed. And I know that this is a mixed group, but I know that the men won't mind me saying that they have found that sometimes the female gender can be a little more peaceful than the male gender, and that's not always the case as described with my talk with my son back in high school. But it's important to get everybody at the table, both men and women at the table. Though women constitute over 50% of the nation's population, they're seldom amongst our elected leaders. In 2008, the year of the last big presidential election, 23.6% of the legislators were women. Nationally, only 74 women served in statewide elective executive posts. 8 were in the governor position out of the 50 states. And 86 women serve in the U.S. Congress. That's about 16%. And then 70 out of 435 in the United States Representatives. Now I know sometimes when we get into talking about stereotypes, it sounds kind of sexist, and I want to emphasize that I'm assuming that every man in this room is very open-minded and not one of the sexist types that some people might describe when they're being. That's right, when they're being describing any kind of arbitrary polling. But some of the polling, I think it's important that we recognize how important it is to get everybody at the table. And I've heard this mentioned a lot especially when we're talking about some of the Middle Eastern countries, that it would make a big difference if women were also at the table, at the decision-making table. So here's some important reasons why women should be included at the table. One is that it would cause women to be better represented, because in a world where 51% is women, it would bring the number of women up to a more representative level in our elected leaders. And then secondly, as a gender, women stereotypically vote differently from men. And this difference is labeled by political scientists as the gender gap. Now, according to national studies, women are more likely to favor government involvement to help the poor, programs to improve health and meet human needs, legislation that protects the environment, programs providing affordable health care and child care, gun control, efforts to achieve gender and racial equality, and peace in lieu of military intervention. Now, stereotypically, not only in these studies do women vote differently, but once they are elected into office, they appear stereotypically to act differently. For example, they found that women elected officials are more likely to include their constituents in the decision-making process, to ask the opinions of their constituents. Women elected officials, like women corporate executives, are stereotypically taking fewer risks with the money and the votes of who they represent. And of course, here's one that's very controversial. It is stereotypically said that women have superior verbal skills. Well, in fact, women use 30,000 words a day and men use 15,000. Now, my husband would say it's because I talk twice as much as he does. However, the women argument back would be that's because we have to repeat everything. So I'll let you just digest that as you wish. There are also significant cultural differences between men and women, which are particularly evident in worldwide programs, community building programs, education programs. Through the Grameen Bank, Nobel Peace Laureate Muhammad Yunus has decided that he is making 97% of his micro-lending loans to women, not to men. Now that seems very sexist. Why would he do that? And his example, his response is well documented. He says women in these countries, primarily the Middle Eastern countries where he's working with improving education, the women are better credit risk than the men. The loans to the women have a greater impact on the improvement of the lives of the children. In other words, the money that these women get are used on the families and on an equitable allocation of household resources. And he has found that the men tend to invest more in physical capital, a new car, a new tractor, etc. The women are invested more in human capital. They're more interested in education in the community, schools, and that kind of thing. And of course, since his interest is schools, that's why he's concentrating on that. How many of y'all have read 3 Cups of Tea by Greg Mortensen? It was a very interesting book, and I'll just summarize for those of you who have not read the book that he was commenting during his work to improve and build schools in Middle Eastern countries. He said there was actually a cultural norm of when you met someone, you drank tea. And with the first cup, you're making an acquaintance. And in the second cup, you are becoming a closer acquaintance. And in fact, at that point, you've gone from being a stranger to an honored guest. But the third time, the third cup of tea, you are now part of their family. So, his goal was always to get to that third cup of tea when he was working with these people and convincing them to help him with building schools. Like Muhammad Yunus, Greg Mortensen learned that there was a cultural difference between males and females. Obviously, it is very important to educate both boys and girls. However, what he was finding is that in many of the cultures that he encountered, the girls were not being educated. So that's why he put his emphasis on building schools for girls. He became convinced that the education of girls was the key to peace. There is, in fact, an African proverb of which he became aware, and on which his theory is based, and that is, if you educate a boy, you educate an individual, educate a girl, and you educate the community. And that went back to what the young girls did with their learning. They turned around, found that the young girls turned around and helped teach the younger children. After years in the military in the Middle East, the U.S. Became aware of this situation. They also found that like in many places in the world, the women were the builders of the community. The men ran the businesses and the infrastructure, but the women were organizing the community organizations, the schools, the churches, and some of the cultural aspects of the community. So they thought, well, let's get to the women. Let's talk to the women about working on rebuilding these communities after they'd been bombed. But because of the culture, they found that the male soldiers could not get through to the women. The women in those cultures were not supposed to speak to the men directly. And so what they ended up doing is sending a team of women soldiers from the United States, and the women soldiers would sit down on the floor and play with the kids and be they were not threatening because of that culture, and because they weren't threatening, they were able to get through and talk to these groups of women about the community rebuilding. Those are just examples. And then there is, in fact, a correlation between gender equality and peace. Political scientists have done studies and found that gender equality has a significant impact on whether or not civility and peace will endure in a community. That gender equality can serve as a means to achieve civility and peace. Is that woman bothering you there? And gender equality can help with the economic growth and post-conflict reconstruction. Now that we're in the 21st century, we have to recognize that we are no longer just accountable to our community. We're no longer just accountable to our state and to our nation, because we now live in a global society. So when we talk about being role models, we're not just being role models to the people right here in front of our eyes. We're being role models to everybody who has any kind of a view of us through Facebook or Twitter or through global news. We are now global citizens. The United States is generally considered to be the most powerful nation in the world, and with great power comes great responsibility. We see a lot of trends here, whether it be fashion, entertainment, or an economic crisis. But for this reason, it is important to stay informed of these global issues, as well as the local issues, and we are the role models of the world. Now, one way that you can stay informed of global issues is you read up on work of the United Nations. You keep up with Congress. You keep up with what your community is doing. And all of these things are very important, but the entire process that we use to express ourselves, whether it's going up before the city council or the county commissioner's court, or a lawyer arguing something in front of the Supreme Court, the method by which we present ourselves is something that is considered to be a great factor. In reality, it is a huge factor in the way we are regarded by others and in our ability to persuade others to come to our point of view. And for this reason, we come back to civility as being crucial, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because, in fact, in the long run, it's the only way that we're going to actually accomplish our goals on a long-term basis. There are different examples I could give. I want to make sure I allow plenty of time for y'all to be able to speak. So in summary, I will just tell you that the tools for reclaiming civility are out there, but in summary of all these different groups through their various methods found is that civility simply has to be a priority. The community has to make it a priority in their world. And we have to insist that it not just be a minimum standard. We have to insist that it is the beginning of higher expectations. So I'm going to conclude with my very own favorite top 10 civility lists, which happens to come straight from Robert Fulgham's book, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. But if you follow these rules, you'll do fine. Number 1, share everything. 2, play fair. 3, don't hit people. 4, put things back where you found them. 5, clean up your own mess. 6, don't take things that aren't yours. 7, say you're sorry when you hurt somebody. 8, wash your hands before you eat. 9, flush. 10, take a nap every afternoon. Thank you very much.
You get to stay there now.
What?
You get to stay here now.
Oh, okay.
No, you get to. Where's the question thing? Wait a minute.
Right there, Freddie, there was.
You got it? Where'd it go?
Yes, sir.
You forgot
Who wants to be first? Who wants to be first?
You forgot the addendum to flush. Put the seat down.
That's right.
Very appropriate lecture, I think, on the subject that we need to address a lot more in this country. However, I ask the question, when does it reach a point in a society that the government just smiles at you and says, oh yes dear, we'll certainly look into that, and then turns around and keeps on knifing you in the back? When is the time for a revolution like we had with Great Britain?
Well, I'm not big on revolutions. It seems like with revolutions you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so everybody loses. I think though, if we use the term revolution metaphorically, I have seen revolutions where people have had enough and you simply count your votes and you walk into the meeting and you vote to terminate the chairman and replace the chairman of the board with somebody else. I have seen examples where, you know, we're in more, you might say, in more docile forms of picketing, that groups have had enough and they do something about it in that way, whether it's a sit-in or a write-in or boycott, etc. In your question, when does it become too much? Like they refuse to cooperate, and I would say when they have become a dictatorship and not a democracy.
Close. Who's next?
Carol, thank you for your talk. Could you share with us a little bit of what you learned from Peacemakers, Inc., and not necessarily chairing that when you did, but you know, some of the concepts that seem to work internationally, not just locally?
Mm-hmm. I will. I tell people it was a life-changing experience for me because probably outside of that kind of a forum with an International Women's Peace Conference, I would have never encountered women from all over the world. There were probably about 45 countries that were involved. And of course, it was an opportunity, being the chair, that I had a chance to sit down with some of the Nobel Peace Prize winners who were very, very passionate about their work. One had helped to bring about peace in Northern Ireland, which is, quite an achievement. Another had worked with the abolishment of landmines in her area, and another one had that was present received her Peace Prize based on the work that she had done with indigenous people, because she was from Guatemala, and where they still had almost like a landowner serf type mentality with some of the indigenous people that she worked with. One of the things that I learned is, as we discussed how to go about bringing civility or peace or whatever you want to call it to communities, that all the women in all the countries agreed that it started grassroots. You had to start grassroots. You had to be a role model. You couldn't be you couldn't be a screamer and then and be able to accomplish peace and civility in your area. One of the most fascinating examples that I saw are some women who subsequently got the Nobel Peace Prize. They were over in Africa, and they did what, I don't know if any of you had to read the classic Lysistrata, from the Greek times, but they actually pulled sort of a modern day Lysistrata over in Africa, and they just told their guys, if y'all keep fighting, there were all these little guerrilla wars, and they said, if y'all keep fighting, we're cutting you off. And that's the way it's going to be. And I think the guys didn't think it was going to really happen. So the women, every morning, they would leave their homes and they would meet in a central area of the community, and they would sing together and they would plot together and talk together, and they would do no housework. No housework. And they would bring the kids with them. Some of the kids were school age, but the kids that were school age, they'd just bring the kids with them. And so at night, the guys would come home, there'd be no dinner, there'd be, the house was a mess, and there was nothing else after that for, you might say, since I'm in a public forum. But after a while, they got their point across, and they actually, before it worked, they actually went to one of the conventions that the men were having, and of course they were not allowed inside of the convention. They were having to stand outside, but the men still had to walk through them. And some of these women were so old that these guys had them as, and I'm using our terms, I don't know what they would call them, but some of the men had known these women because they were their Sunday school teachers or their teachers from elementary school, and and these ladies were saying, do the right thing, do the right thing. So it became a very overpowering, persuasive tactic that worked, and they were never violent when they went about it. That was just one example.
I might make one comment and then the question. If we wait until we have a dictatorship and not the democracy, it will be too late. You said that in most of the religions around the world, the golden rule is found there somewhere. Have you found it in Islam?
Yes, I have. None of them are quoted exactly the same way as ours, but I have. And I have, through the Peace Conference, we recruited people in all different religions. And I will tell you that my experience was that there are terrorists in Islam, and there are people who want peace as badly as we do. And it doesn't appear to be, let's say the civility factor is not determined by the religion. The civility factor is determined by the personality of that individual.
Hello, Carl. In your lifetime, has civility changed? Has it got better? Has it got worse? Was there a defining point when it changed?
I believe, in my own observations, I believe that we are not as civil in our society now as we were when I was growing up. I do realize that we now have the ability to see almost into people's living rooms, whether it be reality TV or C-SPAN, you know, with Congress, and we didn't have those techniques before. But it's almost that all this electronic media has caused us to be more lax about the way we regard these elected leaders, and consequently, I believe that it causes us to lower our expectations of them because we're so intimately familiar with them, whereas they were people on a pedestal before. So I do think that it has changed for the worse.
Do you have any suggestion with regard to the Dallas City Council? They have taken the 3-minute talk period that people once had. They have reduced that, or they're reducing that to, trying to reduce it to 1 minute. They are now only allowing people to speak once a month, and they're changing their policies. In the meantime, they are increasing their salaries, providing themselves raises. To me, that altogether represents a denial of voice of the people of Dallas. Do you have any suggestion for that fractious situation?
Yes, sir. I'd say the first suggestion is going to sound glib, but it's, I guess, because it's too easy, or sounds too easy, and that is you vote those people out of office. I mean, the next time they want to run for office, you campaign against them and you don't vote for them. But I know that your concern is of a more immediate nature, which is, hey, what do we do in the meantime? Are they going to go ahead and raise their salary and keep us from speaking? And, you know, what do I do before they get to their term? And at that point, I think that there is a lot of persuasive ability that we have, not so much on the council itself, like addressing the whole council, as it is addressing one-on-one our individual council people. I think if we were to approach individually our individual council people and say, this is not acceptable, we're not going to do this, we feel very strongly about this. I mean, it wouldn't have to be as one person, it could be 2 or 3 people that went and made a meeting with a city councilman. And I think that we could organize people from other areas who felt the same way we did to likewise go. And I honestly believe that the city council people, at least I'm told, they're not used to getting a lot of individual citizens approaching them. So if several people started approaching them individually, I think it would make a difference.
You mentioned electronic media, and I've noticed on forums when people tend not to agree with each other, they get very insulting on the internet. And I think that probably has a factor towards expanding our nature to not be civil.
Yes.
And you go to YouTube and you see a video that you agree with, and people start having their little spats right there in the comments section below the video. And something like that, you know, probably has worsened the situation.
I agree. And it goes back to the role model situation. I mean, those people are supposed to be the experts, and they're acting like that. I was watching the other day on Good Morning America, and they had two legal people. They were analyzing the Oscar Pistorius trial, and I can't remember his last name, but his first name is Dan. I don't know if you've ever seen him. He looks, you know, very businesslike, and he's very calming as he speaks. And for some reason, they got Nancy Grace in there on a split screen, and he disagreed with her. And she, all of a sudden, when he disagreed with her, says, "Well, you can just go ahead and take pot shots at me all you want, Dan." And I mean, And that guy turned to George Stephanopoulos and said, "I think we're done here."
Who's next?
I agree with what you're saying, that it's easier to catch flies with sugar rather than vinegar. If you use vinegar too much, you're going to be avoided. You know, you can't build a political consensus that way. However, it seems to me that that incivility is an inherent and inextricable part to democracy, in a way, because there's always going to be factions trying to build a consensus. And there will always be factions that try to do that through the those base elements of a population, through fear-narrative. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think the very nature of building a coalition is right there with democracy, because you're going to win with numbers. I mean, eventually there's going to have to be a vote on something, and if you have 51%, you're going to win. I mean, unless you want to get into the 60% rule with the Senate and all that rot. But so the building of coalitions, not only are you accomplishing something civil, but you're also building the numbers. And I agree. There's going to be contrarians who are just like, no, I'm not going to do that. You know, or I'm not going to cooperate with that. And so maybe you work around them. Maybe you don't include them in the coalition. Maybe you figure a way to go around them or get what you want accomplished without that person, and they get left out. And eventually, that person is going to they're either going to stay contrarian and stay with their position, or else they may decide that I'm their leader. Perhaps I should run up and get ahead with them. You know, I think something was an interesting example. I don't know if y'all were paying attention to Ted Cruz's filibuster when he was reading Dr. Seuss and all the other stuff. But what people started kind of coming down the pike with the rumors that you hear that came down through the media is that he was ticking off the people in his own party because he was going out on his own and he wasn't working with them, and they were accusing him of being, not being a team player. And I thought that was an interesting phenomena, because a lot of the same people who were complaining about him not being a team player had been some of the ones who were not acting so civil before. And so when you hear the expression about there's honesty among thieves, I think there's civility among uncivil people too. There's a certain standard that even in people who are not acting civil have, where you can offend them at some point, whether it's not being a team player or whether it's not cooperating with them.
But is he aligning himself with his base, or is he aligning himself with his fellow senators?
I think in his case, and this is my personal opinion, that he was aligning himself with his base who were not necessarily elected people.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Because here in Texas, we understand what it's like to have a filibuster where you actually have to stick to the topic and be germane, or have yourself seated.
You can't read Dr. Seuss.
Right, Dr. Seuss doesn't count. It's not germane. So, I guess my question is more in your role as a mediator. So you have two parties that have such strong disagreements, and one is obviously has a great deal more power than the other. How do you encourage the weaker of the two parties to come to the table if there are fears of retaliation? How do you get past that? Because I think that's the situation that a lot of people find themselves in, whether they admit to it or not, is they feel that if they voice what they truly believe, they'll be retaliated against in the workplace for maybe being a Democrat or being a Republican or a Tea Party person, whatever, you know. So as a mediator in that situation, how do you encourage those who are weak
To come out?
Yeah, to voice their concerns.
I think sometimes when you're in a situation and you're outnumbered, whether it be in the legislature or whether it be in the workplace, that sometimes the only way you're going to achieve what you want is to, some people would say, work under the cover, work on the outside, and maybe you go through an outside organization that it has like-minded views with you, and you work through that outside organization. Or you may find, as I have often, that the stated position, like in a company, for example, is not necessarily the position of the majority of the people that are in that company. Now, it may be the boss's position, but it's not the position of all the workers. And in that case, you can, I think, work discreetly and find out who's with you, who's against you, and you may actually find out that you have a majority that, though you don't have the shares in the company, you have the majority of the opinion, and there might be one or two workers that has more influence on the boss that can then go be the spokesperson.
Any more questions? We have a question?
They're ready to talk.
Yeah, I think so. You get to sit down.
Okay.
Good job.
Thank you.
Now it's your turn to talk. Come on up here. Ella Holman is first. You got 5 minutes.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I think one thing that I felt this for a long time that would help society a lot is the equality of women in every aspect of society. The male ego tends to want to constantly dominate, and what needs to happen is a better blend of both sides of the equation. What's the matter?
Separate the microphones.
I'm here. In speaking about how countries can be ruled, ancient Egypt is very interesting to me, and I think we know very little about the true history of ancient Egypt. They had lots of gods and goddesses, and hence they had lots of beliefs on many levels. One thing that's interesting is that Jesus once was asked by his disciples, why are you teaching these people in parables? And in essence, I paraphrase this, he answered, well, because they're first graders and you're sixth graders. And that's true of all types of spiritual growth and development. We grow and change. In ancient Egypt, the chief honcho god was Ra, the sun god. Well, symbolically, well, actually, the sun is the source of all light in the solar system. And symbolically, light stands for spiritual understanding. And they had an ancient organization back then called the Great White Brotherhood that referred to white light, or the full spectrum of spiritual understanding. So to classify them as pagan strictly is just incorrect. Also, this idea of the golden rule being in many areas of society, of history, that's very true. In ancient Egypt, the rule stated, do unto others as they would have you do unto them, which to me is far more spiritually advanced in its concept than what we have attributed to Jesus. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This Egyptian rule was look into their needs and their wants and judge what you do by that, and not even by what you think their response to you might be. Make it totally even independent of that. So I think that is a very interesting idea. The ancient Vikings, most people probably don't know this, but the women ruled the home ground. They ruled the villages, they organized it, they prepared all the meals, and The husband said, yes, ma'am, if he was told to go do something, and they went out to get the food. And I imagine that's why the men decided they had to build all those boats and sail the world. And it is recorded that it is recorded that the Vikings sailed all the way into the Black Sea, and at one point they stormed the Ile-de-France, which is the island in the Seine River in Paris, with 3,000 longboats. And there have been Norse petroglyphs found in New Mexico on the mountains that predate the Viking era. A Norwegian archaeologist, pardon?
Minnesota too.
Oh, I didn't know that. Very interesting. So those, also in New Mexico, there are ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, and Chaldean petroglyphs on the mountains in New Mexico. As far as ancient Egypt is concerned, and I think we need to think about this, because we're so kind-hearted, we want to help everybody, and we do, but there's a limit to what you can do without destroying what you have. Ancient Egypt lived under rules, largely, of a goddess by the name of Ma'at, the daughter of one of the high honcho gods. And the priest would receive these messages from her and give them to the country, and they became national laws, and they were such things as always speak the truth to everyone. Always treat everyone in a kindly manner. And this is how ancient Egypt lived, and hence had a civilization that lasted for 5,000 years, with extreme, for that time, prosperity and peace. Of course, this attracted the interest of people all over, and one tribe from the Middle East, the Hyksos, immigrated over hundreds of years in until they had enough people and they decided they wanted to own Egypt, and they formed a revolution and split the kingdom in half and destroyed that beautiful civilization. In any event, on that, I think we need to watch what immigration is happening to us, what it is doing to us today. Anyone interested in thinking about that, rather than just emoting about it, should look at a video that is Immigration by the Numbers on YouTube, or Immigration Gumballs, and that's very awakening.
Okay, who's next? Who has to be next? Okay. Oh, come on up here. John Beasley, you're next.
Well, I'm loath to say too much because I'm being a foreigner here, but there are, every now and again, my wife and I get into discussions, and I say, well, dear, you have to realize, you and I come from a different culture than Americans. And part of it is a different experience. We both grew up in countries that had been totally devastated by war, and there was shortage. For example, food rationing in England didn't end until 1953. So the culture of lining up, queuing up things was developed. Everyone learned to wait and be polite because they knew there was a limited amount for everybody. So also on the buses, because men were at war, so after the war, there were a lot of women on buses. They were called clippers because they clipped the tickets. So you get on the bus, and they'd say, hello dear, how are you? And they'd say, where do you want to go? And you'd say, oh, please, I want to go so-and-so. And they'd say, here you are, dear. And you say, thank you. And you give your money, you get it back and say. So everybody would always say, please and thank you. Now, here, almost no one says please. It's almost like a demand. Now, I find that strange, but it's a different culture. It's just because when people don't have too much, you know, there has developed a different culture. Now, there's a famous story by Peter Ustinov. He was an English actor. And he said that when he was in Japan, he was in Tokyo airport, and there were literally thousands of people crowding in this airport. And he said everyone was polite, he wasn't bumped into once. But then he went to Australia, in Sydney airport, it was empty, apart from one Australian who managed to bump into him. So, I think it really boils down to a consideration for other people. Now, I tend to, as you know, heard me speak before, talk about socioeconomics. So, as I say, I grew up in a different culture, but I'm going to go back to England quite a bit, and there has been a change. I think that people are now, they're more affluent, and they become more selfish. That's my view. I think it's somewhat the result of, as I say, of affluence. You know, I want mine, and I want it now, and I can't wait. That's the sort of thing. I mean, I get surprised when some of my friends' children, you know, must have a house fully furnished from day one. Almost, you know, the minute you're married, you must be, you know, that was unheard of in my day. You were lucky to have a house, actually. So I do think there's you know, a lot to be said. But so going back to the talk, you talked about it's really civil behavior, which comes from civilization. So I do think that yes, America does seem to have gone off track. I do think that there is an uncaring element in this country. For example, I'm writing another book. I do that every now and again. Turns out that the richest 1% have more money now than in America's history. They take 1% take over 20% of the entire national income. Now the highest before was 1929, just before the crash. They have a total disregard for the rest of the country, really. And I think it is symptomatic, really, of what's gone wrong. When I came here, as people know, I joined Xerox. It was a wonderful company. I mean, it really was marvelous. My wife and I couldn't believe it. In fact, she joined it a few years after I did, in the legal department. But I think those people had empathy for the employees. In fact, when I joined, we all flew first class, for example. It's amazing. But I think that generation of leaders in America grew up in the Depression. They felt that. This later generation after that didn't. They grew up in the easy times of the 50s and 60s. And I must say, they don't have that sort of gut feeling about people. And when you don't have that feeling, and you don't want to help the whole country, give it education, healthcare, help, get jobs, the country suffers. And I think, you know, this debt crisis we're in, we now have something like the debt, national debt, total national debt, that's to say federal, business, Wall Street, household debt is 400% of the GDP. So it's about 65 to 70 trillion. Now that is total unsustainable. It's because there were terribly wrong political decisions made by people who didn't care about the country, and you know, that's what's happened. Now, it is not federal debt. Federal debt is running, in fact, it's coming down versus the GDP. The last 4 or 5 years, it's actually coming down. That's not the problem. The biggest culprits are the financial people. Their debt is something like 130% of GDP. But I do think civility and politeness and caring about your country and other people is fundamental. And if you don't have that, I think, you know, you don't have a decent, good country.
Okay, who's next? Come on up here.
There was a line from a comedy movie a while back that I don't even recall which movie it was in, but some foppish, you'd think gay character comes in and he makes the comment, he says, "There's no shame in being poor, only in being poorly dressed." Well, I would argue that there's no shame in being belligerent as long as you do it with manners. And in the same manner, as you might say, is if you can do it politely, but I'm actually one who looks at history, and I think history teaches us that getting along is not always the winning policy. I'm reading a book right now. The name is Tin Horns and Calico, and it's about the rebellion. Someone here commented they knew about it. It's Albany, New York, actually, up until the 1830s, had a system of serfdom for farmers. There were rich landowners. One of the main culprits in the whole scheme there was Alexander Hamilton. And the people, the landowner, the people who were working the land there only really got the rest of their rights guaranteed to them by our new Constitution after they campaigned and campaigned and campaigned and got together and really insisted. Now, I'm only halfway through the book, so I don't know all the details yet, but this had to do with a Dutch East India charter and some stuff. It's really interesting how John was talking about the 1% and the bankers. I heard Charles Gasparino speak here. I actually forget the name of his book right now. I have a signed copy, but he was doing the lecture tour at Barnes & Noble. And he basically says that Wall Street has destroyed the economy of the world. He says you just don't know it yet. So how major is the damage that they have done with these derivatives and these different financial shenanigans that they've pulled? There's plenty of blame to go around, but I think the amazing realization in reading about the farmers there in Albany, New York, you realize this entire country, we're all serfs here in the present system. It is taking so much of our resources just to get by. It is oppressing us in a way we don't even see, we don't even understand. And I would like the speaker in her return, maybe she can address this issue of belligerent claiming of rights, that I think it can be done with manners. Thank
you. Okay, who's next? Ray? No? Are we running out of speakers? I can't believe this. We still have some time if you want to. Does this mean you want to give a speech or say something?
Yeah, will you hold my timer?
Oh, that's all right. 5 minutes.
We'll trust you.
We'll trust you. We'll let you go over.
You're going to trust me. I like that.
If you're really good, we'll let you go over.
So I want to say thank you to our speaker, who obviously has a great wealth of experience when it comes to reaching consensus, building bridges rather than just exploding things in midair because they didn't, agree with whatever your notions were. I think that means, in my opinion, and I hope the others of you will also agree, that this is the type of person that we should send to the state legislature to actually work with others to gain consensus and do what we need done to handle the business of the state. I think also that the idea that she's given us about if you're concerned that your views are not listened to at City Hall or by your representative, whatever, reach out to them individually. I hope that some of you are taking that from this discussion. I'm kind of asking for a little bit of guidance here in that it's interesting to me that people who have had to band together through, I guess, a common serfdom or weakness are being denigrated now in society by the powers that be. You know, people attack unions as though the unions have drained the country of resources by lobbying for better conditions, better wages, an end to the work week at 40 hours as opposed to just however long the managers or the companies wanted to have these people work. You know, we seem to forget the battles that have been won in the past to bring everyone up. In, you know, a rising sea lifts all boats, or however that phrase is, I've probably butchered it there. You know, we need to think about what is best for groups of people, not just people called job creators, as though they were the creator inherent or something. I struggle with these concepts, and I think about, you know, I admire people who faced bullets for us in Iraq, but I also have great sympathy, empathy for the little kids that are afraid to walk to school because somebody could shoot them in the face on the way to school, you know, or on the way home from school, or at the playground. And I don't necessarily think that stereotypically that's just a female attitude. I think that that ought to be the attitude of all of us in society. And I'm kind of hanging with the notion that, you know, if we'd like to band together in community, we do need to be respectful of dissension, of other beliefs, but not when they become so shrill and overpowering that they would do something like what was done to Elijah Cummings, who you mentioned, where he's making a point and his microphone is cut off by Daryl Issa. You know, this is disrespect from our leaders. This type of thuggery needs to stop. So, I guess I'm intensely involved in the political process, and that's why I encourage everyone to vote, to turn out. You know, we need more than 5% of people in this state deciding who's going to be our next governor, who's going to be our next senator, who's going to be our lieutenant governor. 5%. Come on, people. Come on. You talk about not being able to talk at City Hall, but then run around, not you personally, John, this is not aimed at you, but then we have so many people who come here and say, my vote doesn't matter, so I'm not going to vote. And, you know, I can't do that. You know, I don't believe that my votes are tallied correctly or whatever. Come on, people. Wake up. Do something. I know every single one of us has an opinion, otherwise we wouldn't sit through this week after week listening to things like police brutality or, you know, peacemaking or fairness in government or economic justice. You know, so many of the topics that we have, we care, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So what's it going to take to get people up out of their chairs? Thank you for letting me speak, and thank you, Carol.
Okay, who's next? It's got to be a next. Is there a next? Am I going to be the last man? Oh, well, come on up here and say something. Ray.
The meeting, I think, was this week, and they were trying to get to the bottom of it with the IRS and Lois Lerner. And Lois Lerner would not testify the time before. She took the Fifth Amendment and would not talk at all. It was very frustrating to everybody that nothing could get done, and they wanted to know why the IRS targeted the conservative groups. This was not equal opportunity under the law. And everyone was frustrated. Elijah Cummings got up. He got louder and louder. He got boisterous. He got out of control. And Daryl Issa says, this is going nowhere. Cut his microphone. Who gets the blame? The media, of course, blamed Issa for trying to have some kind of decorum and to stop the shouting. I'm afraid Elijah Cummings did not have very much civility. If he was going to be totally uncivil, he needed to be cut off and let the meeting go forward. Not much was accomplished because the issue ended up being not Lois Lerner, not the IRS, not the inequality under the law of the IRS targeting the conservative groups. The whole story was ISA cut the microphone off. And that's sad because that is slanted. Elijah Cummings was out of control. That was probably the wisest move to get him to shut up and try to get the meeting moving on. Thanks.
You're next. Come on up here.
Since Lois Lerner was brought up, I would like to point out, if anyone has been to IRS court, you don't have a Fifth Amendment in IRS court. It's very interesting that Lois Lerner is pleading the Fifth, and then actually going out and making comments and giving opinions later, which normally that would invalidate someone pleading the Fifth anyway. So we have a major double standard in this country. I would, however, say that I would believe Darrell Issa did wrong, because I would rather have someone have a voice and totally make an issue of themselves in front of everyone, rather than denying them a voice and getting the blame for it. Thank you.
Come on up here.
It's nice when you can extend your 5 minutes. In speaking of George Washington, I think at that period in our history, in the world history, we had some absolutely extraordinary people who were born with a mission. Thomas Jefferson was learning foreign languages at the age of 5. And when you look at the wisdom of his statement, which I've mentioned here before, about if we ever let a private bank get control of our money through inflation and deflation and the corporate structure that will grow up around the bank, they will steal all the property from our descendants and leave them homeless in the land that we have founded. Exactly what's happening today with the Federal Reserve. Exactly what's happening with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank worldwide. There are books written on that subject. They go in, they make these massive loans. They end up having, like in Guyana, they were a very peaceful, happy country until the International Monetary Fund came in and said, well, you need bridges and power plants and sewage departments and all of that. Probably bought off the president of the country. And today, the interest on their national debt exceeds their gross national product. And they were happy third world people. They could just walk off the sidewalk or the edge of the road and pick any kind of fruit they wanted to eat. I mean, nobody was hungry. Anyhow, that is one issue I think that is very, very interesting to me, is to see how advanced those men at the beginning of this country were. And in looking at what they did to establish this country, we look at people like Otto Bismarck. Our history books show him as this warlord. Well, what he did was that he took all of these warring city-states that are now Germany, that were warring with each other for centuries, because through that part of Europe all the tribes went for centuries that were going here and there. And he allied A with B that he knew were friends on a mutual defense treaty, and B with C that he knew were friends, knowing that A and C were deadly enemies. So now if anybody between A and C started a war against the other, then their friend would have to come to their defense, and they couldn't do that. And he made a spider web of these arrangements all over Germany and brought it into the point of being modern Germany. Brilliant man. He made the statement that something to the effect that the experiment being carried out in the United States may hold the hope of freedom for mankind in the future. And the Tsar of Russia, during our Civil War, put his navy in the Atlantic Ocean and told Britain and France, hands off, you're not getting your colonies back, or you will be at war with Russia. So I think we have a lot in history that doesn't get into the history books, because always the winners write the history. And a lot of what we believe history to be is absolutely the reverse of what it is, as we saw when the Moriartys came here and spoke about the history of Libya and the current war that happened recently and all of that. And interestingly, our lauded representatives like Pete Sessions has a nominal condo here in the Dallas area, but he lives in Florida, where he spends most of his excess time. So.
Oh, okay.
I might as well.
All right, come on up here.
Oh, I was going to mention it. I wanted to ask you if you knew how much the taxes were in Russia. They have a 12% flat tax in Russia. They are less communist than we are.
Yeah, I believe that.
I believe that very much.
I believe that.
They're less communist than we are.
Well, I doubt if I'm going to be as eloquent and informed as a lot of you, but I'd kind of like to pull us back on point and cover some of the things that have been discussed. We talked about George Washington's book of Civility, Manners, and Eloquence. I heard a little bit of that. Sit with both feet together, flat on the floor. Keep your knees together and your hands at your sides. Never put your hands on your knees while you are sitting down. Sorry guys, this man was a tansy. This does not apply to our modern day world. I think that the sentiment is good. I also agree with the sentiment that yes, we can spend the time raising children. We can spend time mentoring people. We can spend time giving a positive message, so forth and so on, in the solution, or we can spend it all in damage control. And I think that's what we're doing right now. Was it the joint session or the State of the Union? The first time our new President Obama got up to speak, as we talk about civility, which one was it that the congressman just went bonkers like they were?
Said, you lie.
Yes.
State of Union address.
Was that the State of the Union?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I believe that that would be a good historical moment in our recent history to bring up when we talk about civility. I was ashamed of being represented by these people, sitting there all in black, dressed like the mob, with these issues in them that separated them from other people, just as angry as they could be. This is the United States of America, not the United States of those who agree with us. And we are going to have to learn to communicate our differences in a civil manner. We have far more diversity in our country than we did when George Washington wrote his book. I'm sorry, I just think it's cute. You know, they need him today. But I imagine back then that was probably a very difficult thing to master. In any case, we are going to have to learn how to communicate with one another in a little bit more of a civil manner, because we do have so much more cultural diversity now. I see people that know I may not agree with their views. Not Ray. I love Ray. I have completely different views from Ray, and I love Ray to pieces. And we can agree to disagree, and we can communicate, and that is what we call civility and maturity and intelligence. But then I see people that I don't know what their sources are, but wow, they're really angry, and they will shout at you that they're not finished. And you just wonder if they left their meds at home, if somebody put a tack in their chair. We don't know why they are so angry. And agree, there is plenty of blame to go around here, but I believe that a lot of the steps that we are going to have to take if we are going to govern ourselves is going to start with the mirror, and it's going to have to start with ourselves, and we're going to have to lead by example.
next? We got a next? Run out of people? I'm the last man standing, so I want to thank our speaker. I think she did a great job tonight. And the subject of restoring civility to our communities, it's more than the communities, it's the whole country. And I think that maybe I'm way off on this, but I think one of the biggest problems we have is that we got the best Congress money can buy. I've said that before, but it has destroyed civility in many ways. They represent the money interests instead of representing the people that elected them. And that's probably why nothing gets done, because the money interests want this, and that's what happens. We get our congressmen up there, and they're not voting for what we want. They're voting for what keeps them in office. So we have to change that. We've got to concentrate on that. My own view, for what it's worth, is maybe we get Congress act in its own self-interest to instruct the Federal Communications Commission to require the media to provide sufficient free airtime for federal candidates in general elections to air their views. If we did that, we'd change everything. They'd end up representing the district instead of representing the people buying their vote in Washington. Things would change. Maybe then we'd get some other things, like, for example, one of the things we can't get done, period, is we have corporations leaving town to go overseas where labor costs are cheaper in droves all the time. We're losing jobs as a result. And corporations making lots of money, and and the people that are working for 30 years haven't got a raise to speak of. And the productivity and everything else has gone up. We've got a society that's in trouble. We might be the last generation that retires the way it's going, because the people coming up don't have the jobs. We've got 25 million people out of work right now. Europe has a lot of people out of work. We went to an 8-hour day in 1938. That was the Fair Labor Standards Act. It affected interstate commerce, not small jobs, but within 5 years, big business and labor went to each state legislature to put the labor costs, to cut the workday, because labor costs were cheaper. And that's how we got the 8-hour day and the 40-hour work week. This could happen again. We go to a 6-hour day, but you can't do that as long as everybody is running Congress, that money is running everything. We have to change that. That's the most important thing we can do, I think. And whether we can change laws as far as maybe we get tariffs on corporations instead of countries. Apple produces everything in China and sells it here. They don't have any jobs here for people that are making anything. So maybe we should put a tariff on it for the difference in labor costs. Then they'd end up creating jobs here, or they'd have jobs in both countries. So that would work to our benefit. And we could shorten the workday. That would work to our benefit. That would put everybody back to work. That would drive the economy. That might help the banks even. Who knows? And then another thing that's happened is we've had, maybe we need to restore Glass-Steagall, because Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they guaranteed all these loans. Then they transferred all this to the other banks. They in turn created credit default swaps. And we've created huge billions of dollars in debt. And we're in trouble now. We know it. We have to change it. We have to work our way out of it. And that's what I see has to happen. So anyway, that's all I have to say about and you got to respond to all the comments here and close this meeting.
Okay, so I was taking note of many of the phrases. The one I like the best is respectful belligerence. But I want to address, I want to try to at least address the subjects that all came up. When I first started getting involved in politics, a mentor took me aside and said, well-mannered women seldom make history. And that's a quote that she didn't make up, but in fact I have found buttons and return labels and all sorts of things since then where that phrase is on there, and I've always really enjoyed the phrase, even though it's not exactly consistent with the civility method. But one thing I think we need to really make sure, or at least I need to make sure that I communicate, is that civility doesn't mean that we agree. And civility doesn't mean that we can't lobby for our positions and we can't stay firm on our positions. One of my favorite phrases when I am tempted to be the least civil is is when I am speaking to the phone company or some kind of bank where you've been on hold for a long time and finally you're talking to the third or fourth person who is now supposed to handle your problem, and they tell you, oh no, that's the way it is. You know, you can't do anything about that. And my phrase is, that is not acceptable. And I know that sounds kind of formal, but I've been surprised at how it works. And it's not so much the words that I'm saying, but in a civil manner, I'm saying, no, no. And they don't quite know what to do with that. They're used to somebody yelling at them, you know, or, you know, throwing a fit. And then something my father taught me is that when you're not getting your way with, you know, one of these, you know, massive companies, you know, that have all these, you know, places that put you on hold and you're working with all these different people, is you say, let me please speak to your supervisor. And they first might try to resist you, but technically they're required to pass you along to the supervisor. And my father taught me that it's not so much that the supervisor has so much control, but that the supervisor is one step removed from the situation. And so you have a much better chance the further up the chain and the less invested the person is in your concern, you have the better chance of getting somebody to say okay to you, because they're just trying to get you off of their slate at that point. They're just, you know, okay, like I'm going to say okay and let that person have her way, and then we'll go on from then. I fully believe that you got to take a stand on issues, and I think that you can take a stand without being disrespectful. I'd like to address, since it came up several times, the issue of the mic being turned off. I think part of the problem there is not so much who's right, who's wrong, as it is that in every game we play or every forum we're involved in, we expect people to set the rules. Now, I don't know, and maybe you can tell me, I don't know if that's an American thing or if it is just a taint fair position, but we all like to know what the rules are. We want to know, okay, what's the procedure here? And if the chair had said up front, okay, everybody gets so many minutes. After that many minutes, the microphone's going to get cut off. Did he say that? Did he say that?
Did early. The time had already passed for the comment.
Oh, okay.
And that came up. It was post-mortem.
Okay. Well, I do think that helps. That helps if the rules are stated up front. This is going to happen at this point. Anyway, that helps. We got to take a stand. It's important to be civil, and I do honestly believe that we accomplish more by being civil, and it certainly makes the environment more pleasant. I know different people feel different ways about Senator Ted Kennedy, but one of the things that even his detractors would admit about him is he was somebody that was able to reach across the aisle to go drinking with somebody he had completely disagreed with during the day over some bill. He loved people, and he wanted to find out, well, okay, why do you disagree with me? You know, tell me about it. And I just think that he was a marvelous example of what I'm talking about being able to reach across the aisle and find out the other person's positions. One of my favorite stories about him on this subject was he had, I never asked why or how, but somehow he had obtained some Cuban cigars in the United States, and he had them in a little sack, in a little brown paper sack. And he wanted some bill passed, and part of the way he was going to get that passed is to get it voted out of committee. And he knew that the chairman of the committee loved Cuban cigars, and he was the chair was, you know, from the other side. So he comes in, gets there early to the meeting, and says, by the way, I have some Cuban cigars here in this sack. And if I get my bill passed, I will leave them here on the table. So some people might say it was a bribe, but it was small. So the chair was trying to be fair, and so he acted like he was ignoring it. And the chair was saying something that might be construed as favorable about Senator Kitty's bill. And Senator Kitty moved the sack a little closer to him. And then the chair said something about, yeah, but we also need to take into consideration blah, blah, blah. And he said something against it. Senator Kitty moved the sack back closer to him. And so it went back and forth like this. But it was a sense of humor. I think obviously a sense of humor is important. I don't think it's required in the conduct of civility. But a sense of humor certainly helps. Perspective is very important. I find that after being trained as a mediator, I am much more able to depersonalize something, and I don't mean that in a negative way. What I'm talking about is if I'm hearing two different arguments, and I'm not personally, I don't have a dog in a fight. If I'm hearing two different arguments, I am much more able to detach and listen to both of these arguments that are being stated, and to kind of analyze it on my own, and more importantly, read between the lines of where are these people coming from? What are they really saying? What do they really want out of this? And I think that is important, but it is virtually impossible to do if you do have a vested interest in the argument. In fact, when I was training in mediation, they said, do not try this at home, it will not work. And at the time I didn't understand it, and then I realized what they meant once I was at home and I was trying to use these mediation techniques on my husband, and realizing it's not going to work if you are making one of the arguments. If you're one of the adversaries, then you can't be the neutral mediator, in the thing. But I always know in our family, I always knew that we were in big trouble when my daughter, during her teenage years, and I would get into it, and my husband, who was more of the Irish, the classic Irish temper, that you hear stereotyped about, and he would come in and say, girls, girls, and then we both would look at each other like, oh gosh, Dad's going to try to mediate this, So it's good to have little measuring points where you realize, okay, I'm out of my league here. I need to step back. I need to detach, or whatever you need to do to be able to examine the situation. I think it is important that we express ourselves and take a stand, because if we don't, what's the point of civilization? If you can't take a vested interest in your community and do something about it and leave it in a better place than we found it. And it seems overwhelming at times, and when I feel overwhelmed, I always go to one of my favorite quotes by Margaret Mead, that never doubt that a group of small committed citizens can change the world. Indeed is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Okay, they kick us out of here at 9 o'clock, and we have to be out here by 9. And we generally go down to Starbucks down at the corner, so our speaker is welcome down there, and you get to kibitz with her, and that's what we'll do. We'll carry on down there and so on. Anyway, we have to be out here by 9, just so you know. And that's the end of this meeting, I think. So that's...
This is William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like us, or follow us, and get notices of all our videos. We love it, even when you call. So when visiting the Barbeck's restaurant, tell them you want your reservation to the next College of Complex class.